Good evening, everyone. 76 years since the beginning of the Nakba. 76 years for the massacre in Dayr Yasin. And we in Zochrot, as Rachel said already for the last 20 years, have been mentioning this massacre every year. We want to remind everybody that the massacre in Dayr Yasin was not the only massacre in 48. It wasn't even the biggest, it wasn't the most shocking, it wasn't the first, and it wasn't the last, and yet it is the most well-known, and therefore this commemoration of the Dayr Yasin massacre has become a tradition. Although we in Zochrot have revealed other massacres in the last few years, and we are trying to also make the memorial of those a tradition of memory. This includes the massacre in the city of Lid in the middle of July, and for the last few years we have been commemorating that as well. Sometimes we also do memorial tours in Tantura. And so I'd like us to frame the story of Dayr Yasin as part of the larger story of the Palestinian Nakba, and not as a specific standalone or special event that happened during the Nakba of 48. So I'm gonna show us some pictures and maps and some testimonies in order to try to put in the time that we have together to tell the story of Dayr Yasin as much as we can. Of course, we cannot give the entire story with all the details, but as much as we can, and showing the general trends, the history of the village, and how this was cut violently and cruelly in April 9th, 1948, and the steps that were taken to occupy the village, to massacre them, and to prevent their return until this day, and the takeover of the village later on, and the use of it for Israeli uses. Although still in the lands of Dayr Yasin there are many testimonies, many memories that you cannot avoid if you ask the real questions and really look at what exists there, the cemetery, the houses that are still there in the neighborhood of Givat Shaul and Har Nof that were built on the village. And so we will slowly try to look at some of these details. First of all, we will speak about Dayr Yasin, a village average size, not of the biggest ones, in the district of Jerusalem, and that was just west of Jerusalem. Until 48, it wasn't part of the city of Jerusalem. It was an independent village. Dozens of villages in the district were not part of the city. They were just in the district. In and of itself, in 48, this has become very meaningful in the sense of the registry of residents in Jerusalem in 48. So Dayr Yasin, that was very close to a Jewish neighborhood that was created at the time. The people in Givat Shaul were counted as people in Jerusalem, as residents of Jerusalem, and the people of Dayr Yasin were not. So when you see the registry, the British registry, so you see Dayr Yasin registries are written as Dayr Yasin and not as Jerusalemites, while their neighbors in Givat Shaul, the original one, were registered as Jerusalem residents. So the villages near Dayr Yasin were Lifta, the closest village to it, just to its northeast, Kalumia, that today is under what we know as Motza or Mevaseret Zion, Israeli villages, and in Karim, another village that had very close relationship with Dayr Yasin, the village of Malcha. You can see them as red dots on this map from 1870. We almost can't see the names of Hebrew names of Hebrew settlements or villages that you could see in the same year in the same area. But if you look in the 40s, you'll see that the Palestinian villages until 48, you saw the same villages still there, but you see a lot of additions of Jewish neighborhoods that became part of the Jerusalem space. I already mentioned Givat Shaul Aleph, but there were other neighborhoods that were built before 48, like Neve Sha'anan, Bet HaKerem, the very beginning of Omema, that was part of Lifta. And so Dayr Yasin in 48 was a village that was already surrounded with Jewish neighborhoods. And the main road, the main entrance to the village Dayr Yasin, was through Givat Shaul. The road from Dayr Yasin to Jerusalem is through the neighborhood of Givat Shaul, so that every day the residents of Dayr Yasin that would go to Jerusalem would go through Givat Shaul and would see the residents and knew the residents. And we know from the testimonies of the Palestinian refugees, as well as from Israeli documents, that the relationship between Givat Shaul and Dayr Yasin in most of the periods, most of the time, were okay, were fine. And there were also some commerce relationships between the two communities. Except for moments that there were a lot of confrontation and tension in the 20s and 30s, like in the 36 and 39, during the uprising, the big Palestinian uprising of 36, specifically, mostly against the British, but also against the Zionist movement and against the plans of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, and calling for kicking out the British colonialism from the land. One of the important moments when we talk about 1948 is the partition plan. The 47 partition plan that talked about having two states, one Arab, one Jewish, although we know that the Palestinian leadership was officially against any form of partition plan. We know that the Zionist movement officially said yes to the partition plan, but in effect we also notice that on the ground the Zionist side did not respect its agreement or recognition of the partition plan and occupied a lot of areas beyond what was supposed to be part of a Jewish land, of a Jewish state in a partition plan. And we also know that their stance was a tactical one, that they said, and we know this in later protocols, that they said that they would agree to this partition, but only to have already that land, create a state, have a strong military, and then later on take over the rest of the land of historical Palestine, or mandatory Palestine. Dayr Yasin in this context is in land that, according to the partition plan, was supposed to be international. In the map of the partition plan, the second one from the left, the red spot in the middle of the Arab state was supposed to be an international area, and it included Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and what was between them, including Dayr Yasin in this land. So to begin with, it wasn't supposed to be part of the Jewish state. And yet, the attack on Dayr Yasin began on April 9th, even before the creation of the state and before the official war with the neighboring Arab states started, with the initiative of Ha'etzel and Halechi. in some ways it was a surprise, taking over a village like Dayr Yasin that was surrounded with Jewish neighborhoods, and it was and a village that was in good relationship with its neighbors, and Givat Shaul specifically. And because it was a small village, it wasn't on the main road, route number 1 that leads from Jaffa to Quds, or Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. As we see here in the data, there were almost 700 people living there. In 144 structures, most of them buildings, but not only. There were 2 schools, one for girls and one for boys. There were mosques, as well as tombstones, and there was a bakery, there were stores, there was a youth center, community center. And until the 20s, the residents of the village mostly worked in agricultural, although the village didn't have huge amount of agricultural land, only about 3,000 dunams, which wasn't a lot relatively to other village. But in the 20s, around the village they started developing an industry, relatively new one, which was stone cutting around the village. So quarries, they started building quarries and factories of stone cutting for construction. This very much developed the economy of the village, and many of the families became business owners in these quarries, bought trucks and were selling their product around Palestine, including in Tel Aviv, according to testimonies of quarry owners from Dayr Yasin. Many of the homes of Dayr Yasin were built from stone, what we call Jerusalem stone, as we can see here in the pictures. And we'll soon see more recent photos, but these are houses that can show the character of the houses in the middle of Dayr Yasin. And here you can see an invoice that can speak to the businesses behind the quarries. So this is the quarry of Hajj Asad Ridwan, one of the biggest quarries in Dayr Yasin. This invoice is from 45. That shows that there is a business, but Hajj Asad Ridwan himself was one of the martyrs of April 48 with the occupation and the massacre of the village. One of the documents that was made public a few years ago by Dr. Riela Zulay, that was in touch with Zochrot as part of our activity. She found in one of the Israeli archives the agreement, a peace agreement, a non-combat agreement between Dayr Yasin and their neighbors of Givat Shaul. The agreement was signed in January 1948. So pretty early on. We know that just after the partition plan was approved on November 29, 47, there was a lot of confrontation and tension between Palestinians and Jews in different places. The Palestinians declared a strike at first, 3-day strike, and it also developed into confrontations, as well as there were some attacks in different places on both sides, mutual attacks. In this time of December, January, in Jaffa and Haifa, in different places, and in Jerusalem as well. And some of these attacks, both sides did very difficult things. Not only the Palestinian side attacked, it was also attacked. And the Palestinian side felt also attacked even on an earlier stage than these events themselves, because the British and the Zionists were going to take their homelands, or at least parts of their homeland, to create a Jewish homeland, while the stance of the Palestinians was very clearly, since 1917, with the Balfour Declaration that promised the Zionist movement a Jewish state, the Palestinian leadership was against that. And since 1917, there was this feeling of being displaced and taken, and that was obviously true in 1947. And still, the residents of Dayr Yasin decided to have this agreement of mutual non-attacking between them and Givat Shaul, because they were neighbors. And if I read this document, you can see the main points of the document. The residents of Dayr Yasin do almost everything to promise that nobody will attack them. This is more a surrender agreement than an agreement between two equal sides. So I'll read just the main points that you can see here on the screen, and it says so. Both sides reached this agreement for good neighbor relations. The people of Dayr Yasin will let us know that any situation of having armed forces, armed groups against them, if they won't be able to kick them out themselves, or to and so they will make a sign. They will put in a place that can be seen lingerie of white and then black and then white, and the neighborhood will see that and recognize that. If it was at nighttime, the people of Dayr Yasin will flash 3 dots of light, and then the people of Givat Shaul will answer to them with their own flashlight. And if they will exchange these signs between them, they will meet at a place that they agree in advance, and they will have a passcode between them. So the people of Dayr Yasin not only promise that they wouldn't attack the other side, but that they would let them know about any other Palestinians, armed Palestinians fighting. So it might be that there were young people from Dayr Yasin that were part of the armed resistance and part of the struggle, Palestinian struggle, but not in the village, very clearly. And in the village, they agreed that there would be nothing of the sort, and that they wouldn't attack from the village the neighboring Jewish neighborhoods, and that they were willing to, as we said, to tell them if there were going to be any kind of Palestinian armed presence. They would tell that to the Haganah, they would tell that to the Jewish neighborhood, in case they won't manage to get them out of the village themselves. Today, on a Palestinian, for Palestinians reading this, it's very difficult, right? Understanding how much the people of Dayr Yasin were feeling weak and feeling under threat, that they were willing to give up any connection to the Palestinian struggle. Nevertheless, we do know that they organized internally to protect themselves, because they still were not sure that there won't be an attack. And so a few dozen youngsters from the village organized themselves and tried to get some pistols or guns, and tried in all kinds of different ways to buy some weapons outside of the village, and organized a bit, and dug a ditch in the entrance to the village, so that in case there will be some kind of attack, then this ditch will be a bit of a barrier for potential attackers. And even though this neighboring agreement, this good neighboring agreement existed, the village was attacked on April 9th, on Friday morning, dawn, and the attack was from Givat Shaul. It turns out that it is true that Ha'etzel and Alechi, the two militias, Zionist militias, came together and decided that they will be part of the occupation of Palestinian villages and displacement of their residents. And one of the meetings that they had together in Jerusalem, they had a list, kind of a menu, which village we should attack. So they thought about Bet Harina and Shafat and Dayr Yasin, different villages, and also others, and eventually decided on Dayr Yasin. The assumption is that it was because it was easier for them as far as location goes. It wasn't too big, didn't have too much preparation. It seemed relatively easy. And so they decided that these two organizations, Ha'etzel and Alechi, will occupy Dayr Yasin. And in their own internal competition with Haganah, to show that they are also part of what they were calling liberation as an occupation of Palestinian lands. But what really shows the violation of this agreement is that on a very early age, the Haganah people knew about this attack and in a way kind of approved of it. David Shaltiel, that was the Haganah commander of the Jerusalem district, agreed for this attack, but only if they will be able to, if they won't lose control, if they won't create more damage. That was his only concern, that there won't be strategic damage, and they won't be able to occupy the entire thing well, in a way, that it wouldn't be successful. And his other restriction was that, the other thing we know is that the war control room of Ha'etzel and Alechi was in a brewery in Givat Shaul, in a street called El Kabetz today. And they sat there. That was where their war control room, that's where they sat, that's where they went to the attack, that's where they got the updates from the village, and that's where the armed personnel of Ha'etzel and Alechi came back to after this attack. So we know that the attack came from Givat Shaul. That's where the main attack came from, but also from the area of Bet HaKerem. From Bet HaKerem, they went into two groups. And so, in effect, there were three angles from which they attacked the village to surprise them. The youngsters of Dayr Yasin that were on a night shift that day, recognized that there was some suspicious movement in Givat Shaul and saw the forces moving towards Dayr Yasin. And so the attackers did fall into the ditch that was dug, and their vehicles couldn't continue forward because they got stuck in the ditch. And it took them some time to be able to get the vehicles out and continue their way towards the center of the village. And in that place, that was the only time that there was actual confrontation between armed people. So the youngsters who protected the village shot at the attacking forces, and in the first few minutes they managed to kill 4 members of Ha'etzel and Alechi and injured a few. But it is safe to say that those were the only place and the only few minutes that there was any form of fighting between two sides. Everything that happens from this point onwards is just massacre, revenge, and destroying entire families, going into houses, killing everyone that they see, and destroying entire families. In other cases, they put people in a line and shot them. There's even testimonies. Meir Bari, the intelligence person of the Haganah that arrived the day after the massacre to Dayr Yasin, and wrote a report for the Haganah and took pictures of what he saw on April 10th, 48. The refugees of Dayr Yasin also testify all the horrible things that they went through, and so beyond the armed assailants that, according to the list of those killed in Dayr Yasin, between 10 and 15 armed personnel from Dayr Yasin, armed youngsters, were armed of the killed people, but all the rest were unarmed civilians, and it's really people from 3 months to 95, children, women, old people, and the rest, everyone was slaughtered in this attack. We will talk about the massacre a bit again soon, and read some testimonies from the massacre. But before that, I would want to say that the reports about what's happening in Dayr Yasin became public almost immediately, the same day. If you look here at this paper clip from the New York Times on the right, you can see that this is from April 9th. So already in April 9th, the reporter of the New York Times reports an attack on the village of Dayr Yasin, on combat and so on, although she does talk about combat and not massacre, but she does say that 200 Arabs were killed and that half of them were children and women. Of course, the Arab press and radio, both in Palestine and in Egypt and other places, started reporting about Dayr Yasin. And the same day in the evening, the Etzel and Lehi people did a press conference and said that they've managed to occupy, or liberate as they say it, Dayr Yasin, and they've managed to also kill 200 and maybe more, sometimes they even said 250 Arabs in Dayr Yasin. So these numbers that later on we will find out are not true. They're higher than the actual numbers, but they caused panic in the area. The Palestinian communities around Dayr Yasin, and it also arrived to Palestinian communities in other places in the Galilee and the south. Everybody heard about Dayr Yasin, and Dayr Yasin became a symbol, a traumatic, scary symbol for Palestinians. And on the other side, we know today that in a later stage, Haganah people used the story of Dayr Yasin as part of their psychological warfare to create fear and terror among Palestinians and make them leave their lands and homes. Of course, in addition to the large numbers of killed, there was also descriptions, very difficult descriptions about what happened in Dayr Yasin. We're talking about, murdering of people with bayonets, descriptions of babies and pregnant women, as well as rape. And telling all these stories together before an attack on other villages definitely did give other families the motivation, so to speak, to leave the village and be displaced, and it helped the Haganah transfer or forcefully displace a lot of other communities with this threat. The news moved so quickly that Albert Einstein himself writes a letter in April 10th to a Zionist organization in the US, and he complains about the fact that people from ourselves committed these crimes, and says, he translates this, you can read the original, but then a real and final catastrophe should befall us in Palestine. The first responsible for it would be the British, and the second responsible for it, the terrorist organizations built up from our own ranks. It is important to say that all of this is done under the British rule still officially, and so they would be the first ones that are responsible, but the other ones should be, as we said, the terrorist organizations built up from our own ranks. I'm not willing to see anybody associated with those misled and criminal people. And so Albert Einstein is speaking against the massacre, but he's also still part of the conception of these people who are saying, like, those people who are criminals, those people who are doing something wrong, it's them, it's not us, right? That's kind of the idea. And this was definitely not the only case of massacre de facto. The other thing that also made this massacre very famous was a telegram that David Ben-Gurion sent to King Abdallah, in which he apologized for what happened in Dayr Yasin, and he said, these are, the criminals, the extremists of Etzel and Lehi that did this massacre. It wasn't his people, as in Haganah, and he apologizes for it. Although today we know that while the Etzel and Lehi were the ones who attacked it, the Haganah were already there in the afternoon and supported, at least in giving weapons to the Etzel, as well as artillery shooting from outside of the village towards the village. And while we don't have testimonies that people from the Haganah were in the village and part of the actual killing and displacement, but for sure they did both give weapons and shot artillery from outside of the village. Years later, after the residents of Dayr Yasin dealt with the trauma a bit, they made a list of the people who were killed in the village, and here Sirul Mahmoud, who's holding the list that he himself wrote. He wrote that with elders in Dayr Yasin, and in this list he lists 107 names, 109 names, and he mentions that there are 16 that he knows personally, and he knows that they were fighters, armed, but all the rest, 90-something, were all civilians and unarmed. He himself wasn't in the village at the time and therefore survived. So the list that we showed at the beginning of this event is a combination of this list of Abu Mahmoud together with a list that's in this book of Walid Halidi that was published a few years ago, that he also met with many refugees from Dayr Yasin and made a list. There is a 99% overlap between the names of the two lists. And so what we did is we combined the two lists together. I think there's 2 or 3 names that don't exist in both the lists, but through that we created the full list that we saw at the beginning of this event. These are orphans whose parents were killed in the Dayr Yasin massacre. The massacre of civilians, of innocent people, is a terrible thing. But what happened in Dayr Yasin is not just the massacre itself. The massacre is part of the larger crime that included ethnic cleansing, taking over of people's property, and preventing them from returning, looting of everything that was in the houses, and even looting from the bodies themselves what was in the clothes of the people who tried to run away, the clothes of the women, and the prisoners who were taken. I will read to you something that a person from the Etzel wrote, Yuda Lapidot. He described some of the things that I'm talking about them. And you can understand that even some of the people in these organizations describe this very different reality. So he writes, he himself says that he wasn't there, he was in the war room in Givat Shaul. So he writes, one of the people from the Irgun, I found Avinadav standing next to an entrance, watching his colleagues and their commander of the stern people sitting on boxes and counting money and jewelry, bounty that was collected in the village from the bodies of the dead and from the prisoners, and they were distributing this among them. So this is a person from the Etzel who is talking about the looting also being taken from the dead, from the bodies themselves. We also know about stories of mutilation of bodies. This is a very famous picture of some of the orphans of Dayr Yasin after their parents were murdered in the village. A few dozen women and children were collected in the middle of the village, between 70 and 90. Most men left the village, and most of the families, as the attack came closer to the center of the village, the direction of running away was towards En Karem, and so they ran away and started going down towards En Karem. The first refugees told the people of En Karem that there's a massacre in the village, but nobody in the village came out to help them against this attack. It could be that one of the reasons that there weren't enough armed Palestinians around Jerusalem in the villages is that in those hours in the old city in Jerusalem there was the funeral of a military leader of the Palestinian Armed Forces in 48, Al-Fatah al-Husseini, who was killed in the Castle just a day before that, and so his funeral was there, and it is reasonable to assume that tens of thousands of people who were in his funeral were supposed to be protecting a lot of these villages and didn't that day because of the funeral. One of the shocking things that happened, on top of everything that I already said, was that these women and children were put on trucks and were taken around for a round of humiliation. The Etzel and Nechi people called it a victory round in the Jewish neighborhoods. So they put children and women on trucks, and the people on the streets are seeing them going out to the streets. The Jewish residents, and in some testimonies they talk about cheering them, that the bystanders were cheering them, the Etzel, and so they are seeing the people of Dayr Yasin put on trucks, again mostly women and children, and they're singing and clapping and throwing tomatoes or things at the trucks. The trucks are doing these victory laps, humiliation laps, and eventually arrive to Jaffa Gate, where there was kind of a buffer zone, where there were also human rights organizations, UN organizations, and Palestinian activists around the old city, and they threw the children and the women in front of the old city around Jaffa Gate. The descriptions of one of the Palestinian witnesses that you can hear his testimony in Palestine Remember website about Dayr Yasin, about this scene specific in the old city. He describes something that looks like Judgment Day. People don't really know what happened in their village, what happened with their families, who was killed, who's missing, who's still here. And he describes people going around between the masses in the old city and just asking everyone they've seen, have you seen my mother, have you seen my sister, have you seen my brother, looking for each other. The families fell apart, and it took time for people to gather themselves and really understand the consequences of this attack. These children walked around the alleyways of the old city. Some of them, strangers are trying to help them, and others, the Arab High Commission tried to organize a place for them to stay, for food, and almost 40 of these children, of these orphans, walked together and sat somewhere in the old city, in a square, and from one of the houses a woman comes out, their angel for the day. Her name is Haiba Husseini. She was a teacher, and she sees them, dozens of children, and goes to them and asks them, tries to understand what happened to them, and understands that they are orphans from Dayr Yasin and there's no one to take care of them, and she decides to adopt them, all of them. She takes them all into her house, then she collects donations and people, women especially from the neighborhood, and makes sure they have places to stay in houses, and later on she rents a place for them. And from this very small and significant human act in all of this darkness, this later on became a school for these orphans that she started. It became a high school, became a college, and the college still exists to this day in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. And it's a college, a teaching college, and so a college for social work. And so from these girls, at least, we can tell one of the good things that happened in the area of Jerusalem. Almost immediately after 48 and in 49 already, the government of Israel started housing Jewish families in the houses of Dayr Yasin, and gradually started demolishing some of the houses, especially the houses in the outskirts, near the entrance, which today is the street of Kanfei Sharim, between Givat Shaul and Har Nof. And until 3 years, these two villas of the Radwan family, it used to be their address was Kanfei Sharim 60 and 62, but lately, because of the light rail project, these two houses were also demolished by the authorities and don't exist anymore. We took photos of them in our previous tours, and here you can see the plaque on one of them that says what is traditionally written on a lot of Palestinian houses, which is Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, So it's this house is from the blessings of God, and it says the year that is 42. So this house was built in 1942 and was still standing until about 3 years ago, and is no longer there. Next to Kanfei Nesharim 15 address, you can see this building. It's a branch of Chabad, a synagogue. It used to be the boys' school of Dayr Yasin, the Palestinian boys' school, that was built in 43 and had a few classrooms. The kids learned there until the 3rd grade, and then whoever wanted to continue to 6th grade and so on could have moved to Lifta, to the school, and whoever wanted to continue also for middle school and so on would have to go further away in what today is East Jerusalem. In 46, there was another school built closer to the center of the village. That was the school for the girls. So in 48, we know that there were 2 villages in the school, one for boys, one for girls. If we continue west on Kanfei Nesharim Street and get to number 37, you can still find this house that is now also being reconstructed, and there's a building being built just next to it. This house belonged to the Zahran family, and the woman that you can see here is Zainab Akr Zahran. She was married to someone from the Zahran family, and she lived in this house. This was her house. Zainab joined our first tours in the village. A few years ago, she passed away. And she was one of the main witnesses that could tell the story, her own story, and the story of the village and other families. In one of the testimonies that we have from Zainab, she says that she was taken by the people of Etzel and Lechi, her and her brother. He was a small child. And she said that her husband gave her $400 that she had on her. And when the soldier came to us, I offered him the money and told him, please let my brother go. He's such a young boy. The soldier took the money and then pushed her brother and shot him 5 times in the head. This woman, this was her last moments in the village, and with all this trauma, she still became one of the heroes of the story of Dayr Yasin. And as I said, this picture is in one of our commemorations that we did, memorials that we did for the village next to her house. In front of her house, there were a few houses of the Zahran family, and that was one of the centers of the really terrible aspects of the massacre. 26 people of one family were murdered in the house just in front of her house. It was the houses of the cousins and in-laws of her husband, and there both her and others witnessed the massacre that was happening there. So they just went into the house and killed almost everyone that was anywhere in that compound of houses. One of the very difficult chapters was what happened to the prisoners. Some men of Dayr Yasin were taken as prisoners, not that many. In the book of Lapidut, when they ask each other, about prisoners, they ask what happens to the prisoners, and they say, we don't have any of them. We only have the children and the women. Most of the men were either killed or taken towards Enkarem. And there were a few men that were taken prisoners. At least 7 of them we know were taken alive and were murdered after they were taken prisoners. One of the stories of Abu Mahmoud, that after 48, he rented a house in the old city in Jerusalem until he passed 6 or 7 years ago. But he lived there between 48 and 67, and in 67 he was occupied for the second time by Israel. And this occupation allowed him to go visit Dayr Yasin because of the annexation of East Jerusalem, which allowed him to travel to go and see his old village. And in 67 he did that. He went to see his village. And he described it with a lot of crying, and he walks around the village to see what's left of it. And he looks for one of his friends that was in Givat Shaul, a guy called Yaakov, the Iraqi Yaakov. And he finds him in Givat Shaul. Or it was the other way around, that Yaakov was looking for Abu Mahmoud. But anyway, they met together in Dayr Yasin, and Abu Mahmoud stands next to this site. There wasn't this sculpture, but there was a roundabout in Kanfei Nesharim Street. And it's what used to be the middle of Givat Shaul, of Dayr Yasin. It was called Bir el-Jozi, the well of the walnut. And Abu Mahmoud stood there to pray and thought that the bodies of the prisoners were thrown into the well. And then Yaakov corrected him and said, I know the story of the prisoners. They were murdered, but they were thrown into a quarry at the end of the village, edge of the village, and not into this well. And so this well now it looks as it looks like here. There's a roundabout, there's a sculpture in the middle of Givat Shaul. When we did our first tours in Dayr Yasin, I heard from witnesses of Palestinian refugees the story of a person from Hebron that was a baker. He was the owner of the bakery in Dayr Yasin, Abdul Rauf al-Sharif, and his son Hussein, that would open their bakery very early in the morning, around 3-4 in the morning, to bake the bread, and so that the people of Dayr Yasin that would bring their dough and they would bake it in their bakery. And so there were a few women already in the bakery in those hours when the village was attacked on that Friday. And Abdul Rauf and his son were also in the bakery. The women who were there testified that these two people, the son and the father, were thrown into the oven and burnt alive. To tell you the truth, in the first years that we would do this tour, I didn't dare tell the story this way. I would say that they were murdered in the bakery, but I didn't tell the story. But we crossed so many witnesses about this story, and so many different sources have said that that is how they killed them, that they threw them into the ovens. The bakery was in what is now the corner of Kanfei Nesharim and the hospital of Givat Shaul, just under the bus parking lot that is there. And you can see the picture here of where it used to be. The center of the village, as we can see it now in the picture, are the houses that we see on the right, kind of all together, and that was the center of Dayr Yasin. So most of the houses that were in the outskirts of the historical village were erased. There are few, but still, but the center of the village, almost nothing of it was demolished. You can see until today the houses of the center of the village. Cynically, the state of Israel in the 50s, in a personal decision of David Ben-Gurion, decided to close the center of the village and to make it into a hospital, a psychiatric hospital. And today this hospital still functions as such. People come into this space to heal mentally in a place where, if you can only imagine what happened in these houses, just knowing the stories can drive you crazy. But this is the dissonance of one of these stories of the Yasin, of the Nakba generally, of using this place that so many terrible atrocities happened in, is where people are brought to be able to heal mentally. It of course is something that, for those who know the truth, it cannot work in your mind. The entrance to the hospital is, of course, closed to the public, obviously, because the patients there need to be protected. But once in a while, almost every year, there is an event there that's open for the public. Either the hospital invites people for a tour in the hospital, or other initiatives, like an initiative called Houses from Within. It happens mostly in Jerusalem, but in other places as well. Houses from Within is like a project that people are invited for a tour to see beautiful or special houses from their inside and hear about their story and architecture. And so in remarkable timing, 2 days ago, there was a tour in the hospital, Givat Shaul, a tour that, an open tour that was people were invited to see the houses within the compound. And one of our friends from Zochrot, Avraham, went to the tour. So these pictures are 2 days old from within the hospital of Givat Shaul, and you see these Palestinian houses. Because the hospital uses them, they're actually pretty well preserved. But these are the original houses of Dayr Yasin, of the Palestinian families that lost them on April 9th. And their return has not been allowed since. And then I recognize in one of the houses, one of the pictures, this house in the middle. This is the house of Helwa Zidan and her husband Aish Khalil and their son Muhammad. That all three of them were murdered in Dayr Yasin. They were murdered in this house that today has Israeli flags all over it, and is considered part of the compound of the hospital. These are more of the new photos that we just received of the village today. More pictures. One of the houses here on the left from the inside, you can see the beautiful floor. We can see these houses in many other Palestinian villages, and in Karim, in Lifta, whatever is left of Lifta, in Malha. And they have the same kind of characteristics of Jerusalem building, Palestinian Jerusalem building. In front of the hospital, mental health hospital, was the cemetery of Dayr Yasin, as well as the mosque, and a maqam, a burial ground of Sheikh Yasin. They were all outside of what today is the hospital compound on the other side of the road. The mosque was demolished, doesn't exist, as well as the tomb of Yasin. But at the continuance of the road, you can find parts of the cemetery. And you can still see it there until today. At the very end of it, you can see this college, this yeshiva. It's an Orthodox college, very adjacent to the cemetery, and you can recognize the cemetery by this little wall and the trees behind it. They mark part of the cemetery. The cemetery was also on part of where the road is now. So the road actually covers some of the graves. As I said before, the college itself is also just on the edge. Part of it is on the edge of the cemetery, but you can still see this area, this compound that has graves that you can recognize. Some of them, a lot you can't recognize anymore. There's no tombstones, you can't find them. And the entire story of Dayr Yasin, one of the very painful things is that we don't know to this day where they were buried, where the people who were killed in the massacre, where they were buried. We can imagine that there was a big grave in the graveyard or something like that, but nobody knows. Also, when later on the Red Cross arrived there, or the Haganah, all of these wrote reports and buried the bodies, but we don't have any testimony on where this mass grave is. So that at least if we would have known, we would have been able to say that it is a mass grave. People would be able to remember there and give it the due respect. But it is still unknown to this day. In the graveyard, you can recognize 3 or 4 graves, tombstones, still from stone. As you can see, it is vandalized once in a while to terrible things that I can tell you about. I can show you one of them that is here in the picture, which is a tombstone that has a graffiti on it that says "Death to Arabs," and it was a few years ago. Someone did erase it afterwards. I was happy to see the next time I went that it was erased. But when we do tours in Dayr Yasin, young religious people, it's an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, sometimes they join us a bit to hear the tour, youngsters. And they listen, and we've had at least twice that one of the young people from the neighborhood comes close and says, "I know this is a cemetery, and when I was a child, I would play there with bones in the cemetery." And the story of the Palestinian cemeteries, the Palestinian villages that were displaced in 48, one of the things that we hear time and time again, and that is very painful, how the state and also sometimes just the population, how it treats the cemeteries across the state, not only in Dayr Yasin, but in different places. In Zochrot, we tour many places around the country, and we see cemeteries in demolished villages, and we see really terrible images in those places. In memory of those massacred in Dayr Yasin, including those that we don't know where they were buried. We would finish this tour. We did it many times. You can see the tours that we did. Many people joined us in different years, and still it is important for me to say that people come because it's a very known story, including within Israelis. While there's still people who deny the massacre, it's one of the only stories of massacre that people know, that Israelis can commemorate and say, oh yes, there was a massacre in Dayr Yasin, and forget about over 70 other massacres that happened in other places across the country, in Palestinian villages and cities. It is custom to say, may their memory be blessed, but unfortunately, their memory does not receive the honor that it deserves. And at the very least, at least until our political inspiration and hope as Zochrot, as political activists, as supporters of human rights, as people who support Palestinian independence and liberation and return, at least until that happens, that inspiration, we will hold the memory of those murdered, of the memory of it, both in Dayr Yasin and in other places. And that is it. And thank you very much for coming to this event. And we will now have some time for responses and questions. Thank you, Oma. Evelyn is writing, thank you. It's in memory of Eli Aminov, whose picture was there. He was there with us in Dayr Yasin. He's in one of the pictures, and he passed last year. So thank you, Evelyn, for mentioning him. Shayal Hafiz is writing in the questions. I grew up with Dayr Yasin massacre, but the horrors you mentioned were never spoken of. It is indeed more than what is capable, what we can imagine even. We will send the recording of the Zoom. Somebody asked for that. Probably within a day or two for everyone who registered. And you can also see recordings of previous tours that we did in Dayr Yasin in our website. And there's a question of how one can do a tour there. First of all, you can arrive to Dayr Yasin. As Omar said, the center of the village is the compound of the hospital, of the psychiatric hospital of Givat Shaul, and it is closed except for specific events where there are tours in it, probably once or twice a year. But the other places mentioned, including the cemetery, are just in the neighborhood of Givat Shaul. And you can arrive there also with our app, I Return, the Zochrot app, that has a map of all the displaced and destroyed villages from 48, with the possibility to navigate them, as well as read and hear stories and testimonies of what existed there. And so I invite you to use the app to continue to learn. And I hope that next year the refugees of Dayr Yasin will be able to return already. But if not, that at least we will be there for a tour next year as well. I'm just going to take one more question. So the question is, I wanted to know if you have identified in the map of Walid al-Khalidi's book, where was the ruins of the convent located? The antique convent ruins from where the town gets its name. No, so we don't know any ruins of the convent. It is likely that the ruins were close to the maqam, to the tombstones of Sheikh Yasin, because of the sacred place. There were some archaeological digs of the British in the area that found some ruins, but today we can't recognize any of those ruins. I think that one of the documents in the Ottoman Empire in the 15th to 16th century, it is mentioned, the convent is also mentioned in its ruins, but today we don't have anything. Avi's asking where most of the refugees from Dayr Yasin live today. And so some of the families live in East Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem. But the critical mass of them are in refugee camps and neighborhoods like Abu Dis and Nazariya and the Kalandia refugee camp. And with the years, like many other Palestinian refugees, some have moved to Jordan. And so there's a community in Jordan as well. But the majority of them are in Kalandia, Abu Dis and Nazariya. I'd like to say just one more sentence. I know that while I was describing things, people must have had, different things that it brought to them. What is happening right now in front of us in Gaza are similar things, even if the proportion is much larger and horrifying. But the ideology, the methods, the practice that's happening today also existed in Dayr Yasin and other places in 48. And so it's important, as I said at the beginning, to frame Dayr Yasin and Gaza today as part of the continuous Nakba, as one event, that as long as justice and Palestinian return doesn't happen and the liberation of Palestinians isn't manifested, it's the continuance of the same event from 48 to today. And we will continue to learn and to remind and to speak and to act until it is manifested, this liberation. And thank you for everyone who's here with us. Thank you, Oma, as usual, for this tour, for this enlightening, it's hard to say enlightening in these days, but in this context, but a very important and necessary tour. And thank you, Sahel, for interpreting, and the entire staff of Zochrot. And thank you for everyone who's been here. The Memorial Day of Dayr Yasin itself is on April 9th, in 2 days. And so I hope that we will all find the way to remember and continue the struggle. Thank you, and have a good evening and better days ahead.